My daughter-in-law wanted me silent. She wanted me to hand over everything I'd worked for my entire life so she could live hers in luxury. But once she got what she wanted, she turned my life into hell. Every single day felt like dying in slow motion. Do you want to know how I escaped the clutches of that greedy, heartless woman? If you do, leave a comment below this video and tell me, where are you listening to my story from? And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. I promise you, my story will not disappoint. My daughter-in-law snapped my bank card in half and sneered that from now on, I would get $200 a month only for essentials. The sound of that plastic breaking echoed through the marble living room like a slap that didn't just hit my face, but my dignity. I sat in my wheelchair, my fingers resting on the armrest, too still to betray how my pulse jumped. Julia stood tall in her designer suit, her perfume sharp and expensive. She tossed the broken card onto the coffee table and smiled with the kind of satisfaction only a person who thought they had won could carry. Sean sat on the couch beside his half-empty glass of wine, eyes glazed. He didn't even look up. His silence hurt more than her cruelty. I had raised that boy to be kind, to know right from wrong, yet now he sat watching me being humiliated like a stranger. I looked at him, waiting for even a flicker of shame. There was none. Julia leaned closer, her voice syrupy but venomous. "You'll still have a roof over your head and meals on the table," she said. $200 a month should cover the rest. Consider it simplified living. She turned to Sean with a fake sweetness. "We'll take care of her, won't we, honey?" Sean only nodded, spinning the stem of his glass as if it held all the answers. Inside me, something colder than anger formed. I wanted to cry, but tears would have given her satisfaction. So I smiled instead, faintly, just enough to confuse her. In my silence, I started to calculate. Julia thought she had control, but she had just shown her hand. When she said the money would be used for something more necessary, I knew she wasn't talking about family needs. She was talking about herself, and that would be her undoing. When they left, the house went quiet, except for the ticking clock and the soft hum of the hidden camera I had installed months ago. On the screen in my study, I watched the recording replay the broken card, her smirk. Sean's silence. Every frame was a seed. I reached for my notebook and began to write. Date time. Words, spoken gestures. I noted everything down to the smirk that would one day testify against her. Outside, the night deepened over the estate, swallowing the sound of her heels clicking down the driveway. I sat back in the wheelchair, breathing evenly. She thought she'd reduced me to $200. What she didn't know was that she had just made her first deposit into her own downfall. I built my life with my own hands. When people in Ohio talk about Caldwell Mart, they think of shiny stores and billboards, but I remember the smell of dust and canned goods from my first grocery shop on Maple Street. I was 24, newly married, and determined to prove that a woman could run a business better than any man. 50 years later, I did. Caldwell Mart became a regional chain with 15 branches and over 300 employees. My name once stood for trust, persistence, and pride. When my husband passed away from a heart attack, I thought it was time to rest. I retired at 62, believing I had earned peace. My son Sean was never interested in management, so I handed daily operations to his wife Julia. She was ambitious, charming, and quick with numbers. I wanted to believe she loved the business as much as I did. I even kept only 30% of the shares with veto power to give her freedom, while keeping a safety net for our family legacy. It was supposed to be a gesture of trust, not a mistake. My house in Cleveland Heights has always been more than just a home. It's a 3-story brick townhouse with creaky wooden stairs, framed photographs from opening days, and a mahogany desk where I signed my biggest contracts. Every detail whispers history. When I walk through those halls, I can still hear my husband's laughter and the ringing of the old cash register. The walls remind me that everything we built came from honesty and hard work. Out there, people call me a pioneer, the woman who broke barriers. They see grace and wisdom, but what they don't see is how fragile respect becomes once your hair turns gray and your body slows down. In business, weakness attracts vultures, and in family, it invites betrayal. I used to think age brought security. Now I know it only paints a target on your back. Still, I keep my routine morning tea newspaper small notes about the company's public reports. I may be retired, but my instincts have not retired with me. Julia's decisions, her sudden trips, her charity expenses, they all leave a faint scent of danger. And while she thinks I've surrendered my power, she forgets that I once survived recessions, lawsuits, and rival chains. I didn't build Caldwell Mart to be stolen. I built it to endure. Sean used to be the kind of boy every teacher praised. Sharp mind, polite manners, full of potential. When he got into the economics program at Ohio State, I thought my husband and I had done something right. But brilliance without discipline is a dangerous mix. It started with horse racing, just weekends at first, then late nights, then online betting. The thrill of winning $100 was enough to blind him to the thousands he lost. By the time I found out his credit reports were a web of debts, hidden loans, and unpaid cards. The first time I paid them off, I told myself it was a mother's duty. Everyone makes mistakes when they're young. The second time, I felt a knot in my chest that I couldn't untie. I gave him another chance, thinking love could fix what shame could not. I was wrong. Julia appeared soon after, all charm and confidence. She took over his finances to help him stay organized, or at least that's what she told me. Sean handed her every password, every document, every card, until he had nothing left to call his own. In public, people call him the successor of Caldwell Mart, the promising heir to my life's work. At ribbon-cutting ceremonies and charity galas, he stands beside Julia, smiling, his hand always resting just behind hers. But I know that smile. It's the same one he wore as a boy when he got caught lying about homework, half guilt, half fear. Every contract he signs now is prepared by Julia. Every decision she announces is disguised as their idea, and the world believes it. At home, we barely talk. When he visits, his eyes dart around the room as if afraid Julia might appear and catch him speaking freely. Sometimes I want to take his hand and ask where my son is gone. But then he looks away, murmuring something about keeping peace in the house. I see the exhaustion in his face, the hollow of a man who traded dignity for convenience. I used to imagine he would be the one to carry the Caldwell legacy forward, to honor the sweat and sacrifice behind our family's name. Now I see a man trapped not by Julia, but by his own weakness. I pity him, but I cannot save him anymore. Love has limits, even a mother's. And as I watch him drift further away, a quiet truth forms inside me. If he will not protect our legacy, then I must. Again. Julia Townsend is 32, elegant, articulate, and dangerous in ways most people never notice until it's too late. Before she married Sean, she worked in public relations for luxury brands, spinning stories, shaping images, mastering the art of selling illusions. She brought that same craft into our family. With perfect posture and a smile that could melt stone, she built her reputation as the ideal daughter-in-law. The magazines called her gracious, modern, and philanthropic. She loved those words because they were mirrors reflecting the version of herself she wanted the world to see. Every month, some lifestyle blog would feature her Julia Caldwell, the woman who balanced career charity and family with elegance. I watched her sit beside me during interviews, placing her hand gently on mine, speaking about how blessed she was to have a mother-in-law who inspired her. Cameras flashed, and the audience applauded her tenderness. But once the lights dimmed, her hand would slip away, her voice turning sharp and measured. She didn't see me as family. I was merely a prop in her ongoing commercial the brand called The Perfect Heir. On social media, she posted videos of herself spoon-feeding me soup, wrapping a shawl around my shoulders, whispering soft words about gratitude and respect. The comments below were filled with hearts and praise. What an angel, they wrote. Every family needs a Julia. They never saw the part where she snapped my card in half or the way she spoke to staff orders disguised as pleasantries. Even the employees at Caldwell Mart feared her polite cruelty. They called her strict, but fair. I called her precise and cold. Every conversation with her felt like walking through a maze lined with velvet walls. You couldn't find your way out, and you couldn't see the traps until they closed. When I offered advice about the business, she would tilt her head and smile. "Times have changed, Mother," she'd say softly. "Women today don't need lessons on how to make money." Her words were sweet on the surface, but every syllable carried contempt. I sometimes wonder if she ever truly loved Sean, or if he was simply her stepping stone, a key to the empire I built. Julia didn't crave affection. She craved control, and she had learned the art of obtaining it without ever raising her voice. Behind her silk dresses and public kindness was a mind as calculating as any predator's. And while others saw beauty and grace, I saw what she really was, a fox in silk-patient cunning, waiting for her chance to devour everything I had built. The old will was meant to be fair, not fatal. I had spent weeks reviewing every line with my lawyer, Colton Fisher, to make sure no one felt overlooked. Julia would get the main supermarket in downtown Cleveland, since she was the one running it. Sean would receive the warehouse properties on the outskirts, steady rental income that could keep him afloat, even if business turned rough. And the house, my house, the 3-story brick symbol of our family, would belong to both of them after I passed. It felt balanced, just, and motherly. I believed fairness could keep peace. I didn't know that peace was exactly what Julia wanted to bury. When I announced the terms at dinner, both of them smiled. Sean reached for my hand and thanked me, his voice soft, rehearsed. Julia leaned over and kissed my cheek, whispering something about how grateful she was. But her eyes didn't match her tone. They were already calculating. A week later, she came back with papers in a leather folder, saying it was just a tax adjustment, a way to reduce future estate costs. She said it would help the company avoid complications after my passing. I remember her voice, gentle, patient, coated in sugar. "You've worked hard enough, Mother," she said. "Let us take care of everything." Colton called me the next day. His tone was serious, the kind he only used in court. He warned me not to sign. "A management transfer can be permanent, Megan," he said. "Once it's executed, it's binding. You'd lose control." But I looked at the picture on my desk. Sean's graduation day, his arm around Julia, both smiling, and my heart softened. Suspicion felt ugly when directed at your own family. I told Colton I trusted them. That was my mistake. I signed the papers on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Julia brought flowers, set them on the table, and stood beside me as I wrote my name. The pen didn't shake, but my heart did. I told myself it was just fatigue. She took the folder, hugged me, and said, "You won't regret this." She was right. Regret came too late to matter. Within months, Julia's tone changed. My calls to the accounting office were redirected. The bank accounts listed her as the primary signatory. I was no longer the founder. I was the retired. The document I thought was a gesture of trust had become a legal trap, a perfectly wrapped noose signed by my own hand. After I signed those papers, the performance ended. Julia no longer needed to pretend. The sweetness in her voice vanished like perfume after rain. Within days, she took full control of every bank card, every account, every expense tied to my name. Sean followed her lead like a shadow. I overheard her telling him in the kitchen one night, her tone sharp but amused. "Your mother should live like people did 10 years ago. She doesn't need luxuries. Discipline is good for her." Sean said nothing. He never does. When I hired a private nurse for physical therapy after falling down the stairs, Julia exploded. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her face tight with anger. "We're not running a spa, Mother. You're wasting money." I tried to explain that the doctor had recommended daily sessions, but she cut me off with that icy laugh of hers. The next morning, the nurse called to say she'd been dismissed. Julia said it was unnecessary and performative. She preferred the word budgeting. I called it cruelty. From then on, I had to ask permission for everything. She issued me a small allowance, $200 a month for essentials, she said. Food, medication, toiletries, nothing more. Each month, she made me sign a document labeled Monthly Expense Report, as if I were an employee instead of the woman who built the empire she was living off. My name, once engraved on the company's brass plaque, now appeared at the bottom of a form like a beggar's mark. The emotional humiliation came next. She began deleting numbers from my phone, old friends, former colleagues, even my lawyer's contact. When I confronted her, she smiled and said she was decluttering my digital life. Then came the comments small and sharp as needles. "You should rest more," she'd say while looking around the room. "People your age shouldn't worry about things that don't matter." And one day, while I was reading the newspaper, she dropped her voice low and said, "At your age, silence is a virtue. Don't embarrass me by pretending to be important." I sat there still, my hands folded over the paper so she wouldn't see them tremble. I looked up at her, not the polished figure from magazines, but the cold architect of my captivity. In that moment, something in me shifted. I understood that her mask had never slipped. It had only been waiting for the right signature to come off. The first real fight came on a gray afternoon when the light from the living room window fell across the hardwood floor, and Erin, my young physical therapist, was helping me stretch my right leg. She was gentle, focused her hands steady on my knee. I had begun to feel a small spark of hope, thinking maybe my strength could return. Then the front door opened sharply. Julia's heels clicked against the floor like gunshots. She stopped in the doorway, her eyes narrowing. "What's this?" she barked. Another performance, her voice sliced through the air. "You don't need to act for sympathy anymore. I'm not paying anyone to watch you play victim." Erin froze, stunned. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said softly, "your doctor prescribed these sessions. It's part of the recovery plan." Julia snatched the contract from the table before Erin could finish. "Recovery plan?" she mocked. "The only thing my mother-in-law needs recovery from is attention." Then with a violent motion, she tore the papers in half and let the pieces fall at Erin's feet. The silence that followed felt heavy, suffocating. Erin's lips trembled. She bent to pick up her equipment, her face pale and wet with tears. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she whispered to me. "I hope you get better soon." And just like that, she was gone, her car engine fading down the street, leaving behind the faint scent of antiseptic and sorrow. I sat still, my hands gripping the wheelchair armrests until my knuckles whitened. My chest felt hollow, but not from fear anymore. For the first time, I saw Julia without her layers of charm and calculation. The mask had finally cracked. She wasn't just cruel, she was unrestrained, convinced of her own invincibility. When she left the house, slamming the door so hard that the walls shook, the echo lingered like a warning. The room smelled of torn paper and arrogance. I waited until the sound of her car faded, then slowly wheeled myself to the desk in my study. The old Rolodex was still there, tucked under layers of dust. I turned through the cards until I found his name, Colton Fisher. My fingers hovered over the number for a moment. When he answered, his voice was calm, steady, the same as always. I didn't waste words. My throat tightened, but my tone was clear. "Colton," I said quietly, "I think I've started to see her true nature." There was a long pause on the line, then his voice came lower than before. "Then it's time we do something about it." It was close to midnight when the sound woke me, a low hum, at first, then the sharp grind of an engine turning over in the garage. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. But then came the rhythmic click of high heels, striking the cement floor, deliberate and echoing. My heart thudded once hard and clear. I stayed still, breathing shallowly, letting the silence between each sound tell me more than sight ever could. Through the small gap in the curtain, I saw her. Julia, in a black leather jacket that gleamed faintly under the dim garage light, her hair tied back with precision. She looked nothing like the smiling, perfect wife from the magazines. She moved quickly, opening the driver's door of the silver BMW and sliding inside with practiced ease. The tail lights flared red, painting the garage wall in a violent glow before fading into the night. I didn't move for several minutes after the engine noise disappeared. The air felt heavy, full of secrets. My mind began to replay the past weeks, the sudden phone calls she took in private, the new jewelry, the unexplained cash withdrawals from the business account. Pieces that hadn't fit before were now starting to align into something darker. Downstairs, Sean was passed out on the sofa, his tie loosened, one arm hanging over the edge. On the coffee table sat an expensive bottle of bourbon, half empty, and 2 crystal glasses. One still had lipstick on the rim, Julia's. The other was untouched. I looked at my son and felt an ache I couldn't describe. Once, he was my pride. Now he looked like a man drugged by comfort and denial. I wheeled myself closer to the window again, staring into the empty driveway. My thoughts turned methodical. Julia leaving at midnight wasn't new. This was the 3rd time I'd heard the car. But tonight, I finally saw her. That image burned itself into my memory. The jacket, the heels, the confidence. She wasn't sneaking out like someone ashamed. She was leaving like someone who owned everything. I reached for the notebook in my drawer and wrote down the time, 12:17 a.m. I underlined it twice. Then I added one line beneath it. Sean asleep. Julia gone. Car BMW silver. My handwriting was steady, controlled. Documentation I thought was the only weapon I had left. As I turned off the lamp, the house settled into uneasy silence again. Sean murmured something in his sleep, a broken sentence that sounded like an apology. I closed my eyes, knowing the night had revealed more than I was ready to face, but exactly what I needed to know. The next morning, I called an old electrician who used to work for Caldwell Mart, a quiet man named Howard, who had repaired every flickering light in my stores 20 years ago. Just a quick maintenance on the motion sensors, I told him over the phone, keeping my voice calm. He didn't need to know the truth. When he arrived, I greeted him with tea and pointed to the hallway, the garage, and the living room. "These lights keep acting up," I said, smiling faintly. What I didn't say was that each light was now a tiny camera, discreetly connected to cloud storage under a new account only I could access. Howard finished the installation in less than 2 hours. He wiped his hands, proud of his efficiency, and said, "All set, Mrs. Caldwell. They'll capture everything that moves." I thanked him sincerely. He had no idea how true his words were. That night, I sat in my study, the room dim except for the soft glow of the monitor. The first recordings were uneventful. Sean stumbling in with his usual hangover. Julia scrolling through her phone, her face expressionless. But I waited. I knew patterns. People show their truth when they think no one is watching. On the third night, the hallway camera blinked to life at 11:48 p.m. Julia appeared wearing a cream silk dress and heels that clicked sharply on the floor. She looked radiant, too radiant for someone claiming to be visiting suppliers at odd hours. She glanced toward the living room mirror, adjusted her lipstick, then grabbed her clutch. The garage footage showed her walking out, graceful and practiced, as if she'd rehearsed this many times. A car I didn't recognize waited outside a dark sedan, sleek, expensive. The driver, a man wearing a gold watch, stepped out to open the door for her. She smiled at him, the kind of smile she never wasted on family, and slipped inside. The car pulled away into the night. I didn't cry. The betrayal no longer surprised me. It simply confirmed what I already knew. I leaned closer to the screen, pausing the video frame by frame until her face was perfectly clear, the makeup, the expression, the calm arrogance. Then I printed it. One photo, then another, until I had 6 neat frames of truth. I slid them into a large beige envelope and wrote in steady handwriting for Garrett. Garrett was my accountant, a loyal man who had once sworn he'd protect my interests if anything ever went wrong. Now I was giving him a reason to keep that promise. I turned off the monitor, letting the silence fill the room. The cameras were working. The plan had begun. Julia's announcement came over breakfast as casual as the morning sunlight spilling across the kitchen counter. Sean was reading the paper, half awake when she set down her coffee cup and said, "From now on, all of your mother's expenses will go through me." She said it sweetly, as though it were a favor. Then she added, "You know how she forgets things lately. I just want to make sure no one takes advantage of her." Her tone was silk, but the meaning was steel. Sean hesitated, brow furrowed. "Julia, she's fine. Mom's always been careful with money." Julia smiled, the kind of smile that closes doors instead of opening them. "I'm just trying to protect her honey. You wouldn't want her to fall for another phone scam, would you?" She didn't wait for his answer. Within days, she began dismantling my independence one account at a time. The first thing she did was cancel all my secondary credit cards, claiming they were outdated. She replaced them with a single debit card tied to a restricted account that she controlled. Every withdrawal required her approval. If I needed cash for groceries, medicine, or even a newspaper subscription, I had to ask her directly. "Just text me the amount," she'd say with a sweet smile, handing me bills like pocket money to a child. The humiliation tasted bitter, but I stayed silent. You learn more from silence than from protest. Behind the scenes, she started something far more dangerous. Using her authority as executive manager, Julia quietly sold off small portions of Caldwell Mart stock, 5% at a time, labeling it as corporate restructuring. I only discovered it through a friend in accounting who still respected me enough to whisper the truth. The funds never made it into the company's account. They vanished into a private investment portfolio under her name. When Sean asked about it, she brushed a manicured hand across his cheek and laughed softly. "Oh, darling, don't worry. I'm just reorganizing assets to make things simpler. I want to lighten your mother's load." He nodded, half convinced, too weary to argue. He didn't see what I saw, the way her eyes stayed cold, even while her lips curved into affection. Each day, her control tightened. Bills came to her desk before they reached mine. Staff at the supermarket began calling her Mrs. Caldwell instead of me. My name, once synonymous with authority, now lingered like a ghost over the business I built. I kept my face calm, my voice steady, but inside I was taking notes, dates, amounts, patterns. Julia believed she was cutting off my power. What she didn't realize was that every document she signed, every dollar she moved was already being recorded. The trap she thought she set for me was quietly closing around her. I started keeping a book like a general keeps orders before a campaign, small and heavy, with a worn leather cover that fit in my lap like an old promise. Every morning, I set the teacup down open to the next blank page and write the date first, then the time, then the facts, as if I were reporting to someone who could not be swayed by pity. I recorded bills and receipts in neat columns, the amounts underlined, the vendor names circled. I noted the hours Julia left at night, the license plates of cars I did not recognize, the times Sean slept on the sofa with a glass in his hand. I wrote down phone numbers that showed as private and then later appeared on the camera footage. I pasted stills from the recordings directly onto the pages, 6 by 6 faces, frozen in the exact posture of betrayal. I used glue that made the paper smell faintly of glue and dust, and when the photos dried, I wrote a small caption below each one, with an even hand, a shorthand that only I would need to understand. I started to cross-reference bank statements with departures from the house, marking a line where a withdrawal matched a night when Julia returned late. I copied account numbers in full and then rewrote them in code, an old habit from ledger days, as if the numbers themselves could be hidden in plain sight until the right moment to reveal them. There were nights I lay awake thinking the book was a frail thing against the thunder of her confidence, but each morning the pages felt heavier and the truth more solid. One night, I stopped in the middle of a sentence pen poised above the paper, and for the first time, the sentence tasted like a verdict. I wrote a line that chilled me when I read it back the next day. I wrote that if kindness was mistaken for weakness, then weakness would be transformed into proof. I did not write revenge. I wrote consequence, a lawful return. I started to address some pages to names, a word or two in the corner, like a stage direction. For Garrett, I left a stack of copies of bank entries for Colton, a timeline for Howard, a map of the cameras. On the last pages, I glued the photograph that had burned itself into my memory. Julia stepping out of a hotel doorway, into a car, with a man I did not know, a gold watch blinking under streetlight. Beneath that image, I wrote in capital letters, with the same calm hand that had signed contracts for the company for decades. I wrote, "Begin the countdown." It felt ritual and necessary. Each entry changed me in small ways. I slept less, but I woke clearer. I found that documenting turned grief into purpose. I fed the book with facts until the book became less like keeping and more like building brick by careful brick, a structure that a court or a conscience could enter and see the whole truth laid out. When the envelope was full and addressed, I sealed it with simple tape and placed it in the safe under the ledger, where a legacy had once been only memory. I closed the book, and for the first time in months, let myself breathe as if the air belonged to me again. It was a calm October evening when Julia brought the cup upstairs. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon candles, and for a brief moment, the house felt almost peaceful. She knocked gently on my door, wearing that same soft expression she used for the camera, sweet, tender, rehearsed. "Chamomile tea, Mother," she said. "You've been restless lately. This will help you sleep." Her voice was dipped in honey, but her eyes were too still, like a lake with no wind. I took the cup with both hands, pretending to be grateful. "Thank you, dear. You're very thoughtful," I said, watching her closely. She smiled wider, just enough to show satisfaction, then added, "You really shouldn't worry about business anymore. Let the next generation handle it." The line was gentle, but the tone was final. She waited until I took a sip. The warmth spread across my tongue, but then something else followed, a subtle sweetness that turned bitter, and a trace of mint that didn't belong in chamomile. My tongue tingled, and a faint numbness crept toward my throat. I had tasted something like this decades ago, during my early days in the pharmaceutical trade. My instincts screamed. "Maybe it's just too hot," I murmured, setting the cup down carefully. Julia seemed pleased, patting my shoulder before standing. "Rest early, Mother," she said softly. "You think too much. Good night." She closed the door behind her, the click of the latch, louder than it should have been. The moment her footsteps faded down the hallway, I acted. I poured the remaining tea into a small glass vitamin jar I kept on my desk, screwed the lid tightly, and wrote on a label with shaking hands, 9:45 p.m., suspect tea. Then I hid it in the drawer under my financial ledgers. The room smelled faintly of chamomile and deceit. I sat still, listening to the silence. My throat felt strange, not burning, not sore, just dulled as though the edges of my voice had been smoothed away. The thought hit me hard. She wasn't just trying to humiliate me anymore. She was trying to silence me. I didn't sleep that night. The shadows stretched long across the walls as I watched the jar under the desk. Lamp, its amber liquid glinting faintly like a warning. I could almost hear my late husband's voice, steady and cautious. Documentation is survival. So I opened my notebook again and wrote it all down: the time, the taste, the color, the after effect. Julia's words, her smile. Each line felt colder than the one before. When dawn crept in, pale and indifferent, I was still awake. The cup sat empty, but the jar held the truth. And as the first light touched it, I realized the war had changed. Betrayal had found a new language poison. The next morning, I called Dale, my old driver, who had been with the Caldwell family for over 20 years. He still called me Mrs. C out of habit and loyalty. "I need a favor," I said quietly over the phone. "Pick up something from me and take it to Dr. Harper's lab." Discreetly. He didn't ask questions. He never did. Within the hour he arrived, his cap slightly tilted. His eyes filled with the same concern I'd once seen when he drove me home from the hospital after Sean's birth. I handed him the small glass jar wrapped carefully in a brown paper bag. "Straight to Linda," I said. "No one else." Linda Harper had been my friend for nearly 4 decades, a brilliant toxicologist who now ran a private research lab in Cleveland. We'd met in the early years of Caldwell Mart, back when we still dreamed that hard work could shield us from cruelty. I trusted her completely. That trust proved wise. By late afternoon, my phone rang. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge of disbelief. "Megan," she said, "do you know what was in that tea?" I gripped the receiver, my stomach tightening. "Tell me," I whispered. "Tiapridal and glycopyrrolate," she said slowly, as if pronouncing a verdict. "In low doses, it's not lethal, but it can paralyze the vocal cords temporarily. Repeated exposure could damage them permanently. It's the kind of combination used to calm patients or disguise sedation as herbal sleep aid." For a long moment, I didn't speak. I heard the faint hum of the city through the receiver, the sound of cars passing, the world moving on as if nothing had happened. So I said finally, my voice flat, "It wouldn't kill me. Just silence me." Linda exhaled softly. "Exactly. Whoever gave this to you knew what they were doing. Be careful, Megan." I thanked her and hung up. The house was quiet, almost eerily so. Outside, the wind rustled the maple leaves in the yard, and for the first time in weeks, I let the anger settle into something sharp, controlled, and useful. I wheeled myself toward the study, each turn of the wheels deliberate. The reflection in the window showed a woman, older, smaller, but far from defeated. I opened my notebook, found the page marked with last night's entry, and wrote a new line beneath it. "Tiapridal, glycopyrrolate. Intended effect: silence." Then I paused the pen, hovering before writing the final sentence slowly, each word carved with precision. "Good move, Julia. You want me quiet. I'll be quiet on my own terms." I closed the book and looked toward the door, where faint laughter drifted from downstairs. The war wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about voice, and mine would speak again, not in sound, but in evidence. I made a decision that morning while the house was still quiet and the light hadn't yet reached the curtains. If Julia wanted silence, she would have it, but not the kind she expected. From that day on, I stopped speaking. Not a single word. No greetings, no complaints, not even the small sounds of acknowledgement that had once kept the peace. My lips moved only when necessary, and even then, sound refused to follow. I watched her reaction the first few days, satisfaction mixed with a kind of careless triumph. She thought she had won. By the end of the week, Julia was already telling Sean that I was declining. I overheard her one evening while she poured him another drink. "She's slipping Sean," she said in a tone perfectly balanced between concern and superiority. "Age, stress, maybe dementia. You know she's lucky to have us." Sean grunted, his voice heavy with defeat. The debts had hollowed him out. He only nodded, too tired or too guilty to question her. When the family doctor came by for a checkup, Julia performed her act with award-worthy precision. She held my hand and forced a tear into her voice. "Doctor, she doesn't talk anymore. I've tried everything. She's emotionally withdrawn, maybe traumatized. I stay up late taking care of her." The doctor, a kind but hurried man, nodded sympathetically and wrote something on his clipboard. Julia glanced at me as if daring me to object. I didn't. My silence was perfect, my stillness deliberate. But what Julia didn't know was that every conversation in that house now had an audience. I had installed small recording devices inside picture frames and decorative vases, tiny, silent witnesses to her cruelty. Each sigh of frustration, each insult disguised as pity, each manipulation she uttered became part of an invisible archive. When she mocked me behind closed doors, calling me a useless relic, I simply pressed the small recorder hidden beneath my blanket. Her voice, soft but venomous, was captured in perfect clarity. Ohio state law was clear. Verbal humiliation, emotional intimidation, and exploitation of elders qualified as elder abuse. I knew the definitions better than she ever would, so I gathered them, the recordings, the transcripts, the dates, and logged them carefully in my notebook. No words spoken aloud, but every fact documented. Julia grew more confident as my silence stretched into weeks. She spoke louder, laughed freer, believing the house belonged to her completely now. She even bragged on the phone to her friends about being the caretaker of a fragile old woman. She didn't notice the faint red light blinking once from the bookshelf behind her. Silence, I realized, could be louder than any scream, especially when it was recording every lie. Julia's confidence grew the way mold spreads quietly, invisibly, until it covered everything. Believing she had finally silenced me for good, she began to move like a predator in an empty field. The first theft came wrapped in paperwork. Using an old power of attorney document I'd signed years ago when I had surgery, she accessed my main bank account and began transferring funds, small amounts at first, then larger, steady withdrawals disguised as maintenance costs. She must have thought her finesse was flawless, but in my world, every transaction leaves a fingerprint. Within weeks, she was tampering with company emails, too. I watched from my study as she typed in my old address on her laptop, the glow of the screen reflected in her eyes. She forged my digital signature on internal communications from Caldwell Mart's board, authorizing a partial sale of shares. The buyer was a man named Mark Henson, an opportunist who'd been circling my company for years waiting for a weak link. Julia had become that link, eager to sell pieces of my legacy to him under the guise of strategic partnership. The deal went further than I imagined. She signed a management transfer agreement, giving Henson Retail Group operational rights over one of our flagship stores in Cleveland. In exchange, A deposit of $250,000 appeared in a private account under the name Aurelia White, a name Julia once used for an old PR blog. She must have smiled when she saw the money, thinking she had outsmarted everyone, including the woman she thought could no longer speak. But I was watching. Long before she started her game, I had already set mine in motion. Colton Fisher, my attorney, the only man who had handled Caldwell Mart's founding papers, still had authorized trustee access to all business accounts. At my request, he began monitoring every financial movement, quietly tracing IP addresses, timestamps, and cross-account transfers. Julia never knew that every email she forged and every dollar she moved was mirrored in a secured legal archive. Each day, Colton sent discreet updates labeled Maintenance Review to an encrypted inbox only I could open. Inside were detailed reports, amounts, recipients' evidence. Julia walked through the house each evening, radiant with false serenity, pouring herself wine, humming softly, believing she had built an empire atop my silence. But she didn't understand. My silence was never surrender. It was surveillance. And the woman she thought mute was documenting her downfall transaction by transaction. I sat at the old oak table with the envelope open in front of me, the photographs and printouts spread like a map of betrayal, and I wrote to Garrett with a hand that did not shake. I told him that I would not call for justice with my voice, but with facts, and I asked him to speak for me if my voice were taken. I dated the letter, folded it carefully, and asked Dale to take it to Columbus the next morning. Garrett had been sheriff for 20 years, a man who understood evidence and procedure the way a farmer understands seasons, and I needed that steadiness more than I needed sympathy. After sealing the letter, I sat back and read the pages one more time, making sure every attachment was labeled and every photograph matched a time and a transaction in my notebook. There was the jar of tea marked suspect with the lab result tucked behind it. The screenshots from the cameras with license plates and timestamps, and a ledger printout showing the transfers that had been routed into the Aurelia account. I addressed each item in plain language so that no detective could mistake hesitancy for uncertainty. When Dale left with the envelope, I turned my attention to Colton. I had him wait in his downtown office, and when I arrived, I wheeled myself into his conference room like a woman going to a board meeting. He greeted me with a slow nod and spread his own copies on the table. We went over everything line by line, the way two people prepare for testimony. Colton explained the tools we had. He said that with the recordings, the chemical analysis, and the financial trail, we could present a compelling case for immediate action. He mentioned emergency conservatorship as a legal instrument designed to protect both assets and person when abuse or exploitation is suspected. He asked if I was willing to continue the performance of silence for the sake of the greater work. I nodded. He asked me to trust him to file petitions to request temporary freezes on accounts and to move evidence into a secure legal archive where it could not be altered. He spoke quietly of chain of custody affidavits and subpoenas, words that used to be the background music of my life and that now sounded like surgery. At one point, Colton looked up and said that if I stayed silent a few more weeks and let Julia keep thinking she had silenced me, she would become careless and would reveal the pattern of her own undoing. He used a phrase about making someone step into their own trap. I felt a small smile rise and wrote on a scrap of paper that I had been acting all my life and that this time the lead role belonged to me. The plan was set. Garrett would arrive with the authority and force his badge still carried in their world. Colton would marshal the legal papers, and I would keep silence as my instrument each day of quiet, building the proof that would speak louder than any confession. I left the office with a calmness that felt like armor, the envelope tucked into Dale S. bag, as if it already carried the weight of what was to come. Garrett Reeves never hesitated when he received my letter. He had been retired from the Ohio State Police for nearly 10 years, but the instincts never left him. The morning after reading it, he called in a few old favors quietly, the way men of his generation do when justice feels personal. Within a week, he was back in motion, his badge long retired, but his influence still sharp. He reached out to a friend at the FBI field office in Columbus, someone he had trained decades earlier. Under the guise of a legitimate financial investigation, they began tracking Julia's movements and digital activity, ensuring everything was within the boundaries of the law. Garrett understood procedure better than anyone, and he wanted whatever he found to hold up in court, not just in rumor. The first discovery came quickly. Surveillance footage showed Julia visiting the Maplewood Hotel several times a week, usually in the late afternoons. Each time she wore sunglasses, carried a small leather briefcase, and walked straight to the elevator with practiced confidence. Waiting for her there was a man Garrett recognized immediately from corporate databases. Mark Henson, CEO of Henson Retail Group, Caldwell Mart's fiercest competitor. The same man who had been negotiating strategic partnerships with her behind my back. The deeper they dug, the uglier the pattern became. Garrett's contact at the FBI pulled transactional data and linked Julia's visits to a specific Caldwell Mart corporate card. Several of her so-called marketing expense entries matched the exact dates of the hotel stays. The billing addresses lined up. Even the minibar charges were filed under client entertainment. Each receipt became a nail in the coffin of her carefully constructed persona. Within 2 weeks, Garrett compiled a folder thicker than a police case file. Inside were time-stamped photos of Julia and Mark entering the same suite credit card statements, and even footage from the hotel lobby showing Julia signing receipts in her own hand. He had seen enough infidelity cases in his career to know the signs, but this was more than an affair. It was espionage disguised as romance. In his report to me, he wrote with his familiar economy of words, "She's not just unfaithful, Megan. She's selling your name to the competition." When I read that line, my hands didn't shake. I had already known what kind of woman Julia was. But seeing her betrayal captured in evidence stripped of excuses gave my silence new purpose. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was reclamation. I placed Garrett's report in the safe next to the letter I had written him weeks earlier and whispered into the empty room, though no one could hear me. "You taught me well, big brother." The investigation had turned, and this time, the hunter carried my blood. Colton Fisher had always been the quiet sort of lawyer the kind people underestimated until they realized he'd already rewritten the rules of the game. When I first hired him decades ago to draft Caldwell Mart's franchise agreements, I chose him for one reason: precision. Now, years later, that same precision was about to save everything I had built. After our meeting, Colton returned to his downtown office and began what he later called a forensic resurrection. He pulled every document Julia had touched in the past 2 years: the power of attorney, the management transfer forms, the equity agreements. For 3 nights straight, he worked under a single desk lamp surrounded by files that smelled of paper ink and deceit. In one of the old contracts, he found what he needed: a clause buried deep in the trust documentation titled Fiduciary Obligation, Section 14B. It stated that any misuse of trustee authority for personal gain would constitute trustee abuse, a violation that under Ohio corporate law could void all transactions made thereafter. Julia hadn't just crossed a line, she had erased it. Colton then turned his focus to the digital trail. Through his remaining access to Caldwell Mart's legal email server, he began cross-referencing Julia's internal correspondence with her private Gmail account. What he uncovered was damning. Julia had signed a covert private share acquisition agreement with Mark Henson worth $3.2 million, an under-the-table sale of company equity that bypassed board approval. The attached PDF files revealed edited metadata showing that the original drafts had been altered after electronic signatures were added. She had copied my digital signature, slightly compressed it, and pasted it into final documents, a maneuver that might have fooled shareholders, but not Colton. Under federal law, that act alone could qualify as wire fraud, a serious criminal offense. He didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, he compiled every piece of evidence, contracts, email logs, metadata trails, and transaction receipts, and packaged them into a single encrypted folder labeled Case Delta. Then, acting through a secure proxy server, he submitted the file anonymously to the Ohio Department of Financial Oversight. The report was flagged as a confidential whistleblower tip, complete with timestamps and source verification. Colton called me that evening, his tone calm but resolute. When she makes her next move, he said the system will already be watching. She'll think she's in control, but every keystroke will tighten the loop. I didn't need to reply. I only smiled through the receiver, the kind of smile that had built an empire once. The board was still the same. Only the players had changed. And now the queen was quietly moving back into checkmate position. With Colton's help, I began reclaiming what was mine, not with fury, but with precision. For weeks, we had worked in shadows, collecting proof and building a timeline. Now it was time to move quietly, but decisively. In Colton's office, surrounded by files and the faint scent of old leather, he slid a single folder across the desk toward me. "This," he said, tapping the document inside, "is your husband's legacy." The key we kept buried long enough. Inside was the paperwork for the Caldwell Living Trust, a financial mechanism my late husband and Colton had created years ago. It was a dormant account, untouched since his passing, set up as a living trust, with only 2 authorized signatures, his and mine, with Colton serving as co-trustee. Julia never knew it existed. That was its strength. Through this trust, we could reroute every remaining Caldwell Mart share and liquid asset into a secure channel beyond her reach. The process took hours of verification, encryption, and notarization. Colton read each line aloud while I signed my name steady on every page. "Once this is active," he explained, "every dividend, every profit from the last quarter, and every unencumbered asset will go straight into the trust. Julia's accounts will see nothing. It will be as if she's holding an empty shell." His tone was calm, almost surgical. For the first time in months, I felt the solid ground returning beneath me. Next came the critical step. Colton drafted a formal document titled Revocation of Delegation, citing Section 707 of the Ohio Civil Code, the clause allowing a principal to revoke previously granted managerial authority in cases of abuse or breach of fiduciary duty. I watched as he typed the final line, his expression thoughtful. "Once this is filed," he said, "Julia will no longer be your legal representative. Every action she takes afterward, every withdrawal, every sale will constitute unauthorized conduct. In plain terms, it becomes a crime." I signed the revocation, sealing it with quiet satisfaction. The weight of the pen felt different this time, not defensive, but deliberate. Colton gathered the documents and sent encrypted copies to both the state registry and Garrett's private archive. "It's done," he said, leaning back. "You've taken back control." That evening, I sat in my study, the same room where Julia once stood, smirking with a wine glass in her hand. The balance had shifted. Somewhere across town, she still believed she was winning, still counting profits that no longer belonged to her. She didn't know that every move she made from now on would be evidence, every transaction a confession. I poured myself a cup of tea, the real kind this time, and looked out into the quiet Cleveland night. The war was no longer about survival. It was about restoration. The plan moved into its next phase, surveillance wrapped in legality. Through Colton's referral, I hired an independent financial analyst named Carla Jensen, a woman in her 40s with the calm, precise air of someone who had spent her life tracing invisible money trails. She had once worked with the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, and she knew how to follow the kind of digital footprints most people thought vanished in code. We met in Colton's office late one afternoon. Carla set down her laptop and said, "Mrs. Caldwell, I don't need to hack anything. All I need is consent and access to your trust's monitoring rights. From there, we let the system watch for us." Her fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard as she logged into the Federal Reporting Network. Within minutes, she configured a silent alert, an automated trigger that would notify us whenever Julia's bank account registered any transaction above $5,000. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every deposit would be time-stamped and archived before Julia even saw her own balance update. The results came faster than expected. Within 3 days, the first alert appeared: $7,200 transferred to an account under the name M. Henson. Then another for $9,600 disguised as consulting fee. Carla printed each report, highlighting patterns. "This is textbook layering," she explained. "Small amounts structured to evade reporting thresholds. She's laundering her own theft." Her calm professionalism was almost chilling. Meanwhile, Garrett was coordinating from his end. With quiet help from an old colleague still working in law enforcement, he arranged for Julia's license plate to be entered into a passive surveillance database used by retail security networks. Whenever her BMW appeared in a luxury shopping district or high-end mall, the system flagged it. Within a week, Garrett sent me photos Julia loading the back of her car with shopping bags from designer boutiques, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses, the image of indulgence built on stolen funds. Each piece of data was meticulously cataloged. Carla produced full financial statements, cross-referenced with GPS data and timestamps. Garrett's photos were embedded into a chronological report, matched with the transaction logs from the same hours. The paper trail told a story so clear it barely needed words: money stolen, spent, flaunted. Colton came by the next morning to review everything. We divided the documentation into 2 sealed envelopes. The first, labeled File A, financial fraud, contained bank records, FinCEN alerts, and Carla's certified report. The second, File B, poisoning and elder abuse, held the lab tests, the voice recordings, and the medical notes from Dr. Harper. I watched Colton seal them both with his notary stamp, his expression solemn but satisfied. For the first time in months, I exhaled deeply. The pieces were all on the table: dates, faces, transfers, chemicals. Julia thought she was still moving freely, but every step she took now left a footprint. And soon, those footprints would lead straight into her own trap. The night before Julia was due to sign the final papers at the bank, I could hardly sleep. But the house felt oddly alive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I wheeled into the study, where the lamp cast a soft pool of light on the table, and spread the folder open like a map. The stack of documents was thick, nearly 300 pages each sheet, a small verdict. There were camera stills with timestamps that showed Julia at the Maplewood Hotel, receipts that matched the corporate cards, lab reports from Linda confirming the compounds in the T audio transcripts of her taunting comments, and the forged agreements Colton had unearthed with notes about metadata and signature tampering. I handled each page the way a seamstress handles fine lace, careful not to smudge, careful to set each piece exactly where it would be plain and undeniable. Garrett arrived just after midnight, the tires of his truck whispering on the driveway. He parked out of sight and came in without fanfare, closing the door, as if we were staging something sacred. He sat down and began to read his face a map of concentration. When he reached the last page, he looked up and asked a question in that low voice that used to command precincts and courtrooms. He asked whether I wanted her taken in red-handed, or whether I preferred a different end. I looked at him and felt the old certainty gather in my chest like a steady flame. I told him that I wanted Julia to relearn the meaning of justice with her own hands, that I wanted the law to be what removed her, not my anger. My voice was small because I had been practicing silence, but the words were iron. We went over timing and contingencies as if planning a gentle ambush. Colton would file the revocation and activate the living trust that morning, which would isolate the assets and make any further transfers unlawful. Garrett would coordinate with his old contacts to have officers present at the bank and at the mall, where Julia would be that afternoon. Carla would flag any transfer over $5,000 so that the financial trail would be visible in real time. We discussed entry points, how security cameras at the bank would capture any attempt to complete the illicit sale, and the phrasing that would ensure witnesses understood they were seeing proof, not rumor. Every step had a backup. Every backup had a fallback. I felt no triumph. I felt a patient focus, like a woman tuning an instrument before the performance. There was an odd tenderness, too, directed at the life I had built, and the idea that truth could be restored without spectacle. Garrett folded the final report, sealed it in an envelope, and set it in my hand. He said it plainly that he would be ready to move when I gave the signal. I wrote nothing. Instead, I reached for the small note I had placed earlier on the lampstand and tore it into 2 strips. One I handed to Garrett. The other I tucked into my ledger, a private relic of the plan. When dawn thinly washed the sky, I drafted a short message to Colton and sent it with deliberate calm. I told him to have his people at the mall and at the bank. I told him it was time. Then I closed the laptop, put the folder back into the safe, and sat quietly in the study until the house woke. The next day, she would arrive thinking she had conquered silence. The next day, she would see that the law still has teeth, and that sometimes the quietest voice can call an army. The morning arrived sharp and bright, the kind of Ohio morning that carries the smell of cold metal and gasoline. Julia stood in front of her mirror, admiring herself in a red silk dress that shimmered like warning light. Her hair was styled perfectly, her diamond earrings catching the sun as if even the light conspired to flatter her. She slipped on a pair of high heels, picked up her designer handbag, and walked toward the driveway, where her brand new BMW waited gleaming and spotless. Inside the trunk, wrapped neatly in a leather pouch, was a thick envelope of cash money, drawn straight from my safe 2 nights earlier. Julia hummed a tune as she drove, the kind of carefree melody that arrogance hums when it believes it has already won. Halfway down the interstate, she dialed Mark Henson's number, switching to speakerphone as her manicured fingers tapped the steering wheel. "Mark," she said, her tone smooth as champagne, "this afternoon, I'll sign the papers. Caldwell Mart will officially be yours." On the other end, Mark chuckled, congratulating her on a job well done. What neither of them knew was that the call, like every transaction from her account, was being monitored and recorded under the financial surveillance order Colton and Carla had quietly triggered days ago. At 10:17 a.m., Julia pulled into the Summit Plaza, the city's most exclusive shopping district. She parked confidently near the front entrance, flipping her hair, before stepping out the red dress, a striking contrast against the gray pavement. Every camera in that plaza caught her arrival, the same plaza where Colton's contacts had placed discreet plainclothes officers from the Financial Crimes Task Force. Julia walked into the Chanel boutique, smiling with practiced charm. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said to the young sales associate. "Show me something new, something that says, 'I own the world.'" The clerk, unaware of the storm approaching, fetched a limited edition purse priced at $6,000. Julia handed over her platinum card, the one linked to funds she'd stolen from my locked accounts. The machine beeped, processing. For 2 long seconds, the transaction seemed normal. Then the screen froze, flashing red. Transaction suspended. Suspicious activity report filed. Julia frowned, tried again. The same message appeared. Behind the counter, the clerk's hands trembled slightly. Across the street, Carla received a silent notification from the FinCEN system. Flagged transaction exceeding $5,000 account, linked to Caldwell Mart's restricted trust. Within seconds, a chain reaction began. The alert pinged the Regional Financial Task Force, triggering an automated call to the local police precinct. The words "state-level money laundering activity" appeared in bold on the officer's screen. Julia didn't notice any of it yet. She only noticed her card declining, her smile beginning to falter. A moment later, a uniformed officer entered the store pretending to browse. Then another. Outside, Garrett's unmarked car rolled quietly into the parking lot, the faint blue light on his dashboard flickering once before going dark again. The trap had closed beautifully, silently, and entirely by the book. The moment came like a crack of thunder in a silent room. Julia was still leaning over the counterpen, poised elegantly in her manicured hand, about to sign the purchase receipt for her latest indulgence. The Chanel clerk smiled nervously, unaware of the storm brewing just behind her. Then the glass doors opened with a firm push, and 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. Their voices were steady, practiced, carrying the unmistakable tone of authority. "Mrs. Julia Townsend. Caldwell, one of them, said you are being detained for investigation regarding financial fraud and elder abuse." The words sliced through the perfume-thick air of the boutique. Julia froze, her signature half-scrawled on the paper. The pen slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the marble counter. Slowly, she turned her face pale beneath the layers of makeup. And there, standing by the entrance, his posture straight and composed, was Garrett Reeves. He wasn't wearing his old badge, but the dark police-style jacket and the quiet steel in his eyes made it clear that command was something he never truly retired from. 2 younger officers flanked him, watching Julia's every move. Garrett's expression was unreadable, but his gaze, sharp, unwavering, cut through the room like cold light. Julia took a step back, her voice trembling at first, then rising into fury. "You can't arrest me here. This is harassment. I'm calling my lawyer." Before she could reach into her bag, another figure entered, the man she feared most at that moment. Colton Fisher stepped forward, impeccably calm, a black briefcase in hand. He greeted the officers quietly, and then placed the briefcase on the counter beside the stunned sales associate. The gold-embossed labels on its side read, "Evidence Folder A and Evidence Folder B." Colton met Julia's glare with the patience of someone who had already won. "You won't need to call your lawyer," he said evenly. "You're looking at him." Julia's voice cracked. "You traitor! You can't do this. You don't have a warrant." Colton adjusted his glasses and opened the folder with deliberate care. Inside were printed documents, photographs, and certified reports, all neatly tabbed and dated. "We have a detention order from the State Court of Ohio," he replied, sliding the papers toward one of the officers. "And, more importantly, Mrs. Caldwell, we have a witness. Someone who's been waiting a long time to see you." Julia's breath hitched. The air in the boutique seemed to shrink around her as Garrett gave a small nod to the officers. Outside, shoppers slowed, whispering, as the once perfect image of elegance began to crumble. And when the officers gently took Julia's arm, her composure broke completely. The red dress that had once been her armor now looked garish under the white store lights, her reflection in the mirrored wall showing not victory, but ruin. The law had arrived not with vengeance, but with precision, and justice at last had found its stage. The glass doors slid open again, and for a moment all the noise in the mall seemed to fade. I could feel every eye turn toward me as the wheels of my chair clicked softly against the polished floor. The scent of expensive perfume hung in the air, sharp and sweet, almost mocking. I adjusted the lapel of my gray coat and lifted my head. After months of silence, this was my moment to speak. The young clerk froze when she saw me. The officers moved aside to make space, and I saw Garrett standing near the entrance, steady, calm, unshakable, just as he'd been when he wore the badge. Behind me, Colton placed his hand gently on the wheelchair before stepping back. I drew a slow breath. My voice, when it came, surprised even me, firm, steady, alive. "I thought you wanted me silent forever, Julia," I said. "But it seems the medicine you chose only made me stronger." My words cut through the room like a blade wrapped in velvet. For a long second, no one moved. The chandeliers glimmered above us, casting fractured light across the marble floor. Then Julia turned. The color drained from her face as if she were seeing a ghost. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. She took a hesitant step back. I could see the panic bloom behind her eyes, the realization that her power had dissolved the moment I appeared. You're supposed to be," she stammered. "Alive," I asked softly, holding her gaze. "That's what truth does, Julia. It survives everything." A hush fell over the boutique. Even the faint background music had stopped. The air felt heavy, suspended between us. I noticed the young clerk's trembling hand as she fumbled with the register, the metallic sound of a dropped pen echoing like thunder in the stillness. Then I heard the faint click of a camera. Someone outside had begun recording. A moment later, another phone was raised, and then another. Within minutes, a small crowd had formed beyond the glass faces, pressed close, witnessing what they didn't yet understand, a reckoning public and inevitable. Julia's lips trembled. "You set me up," she hissed, voice cracking under the weight of fury and fear. "No," I replied quietly. "You set yourself up. I just kept the receipts." The room erupted in whispers. Every flash of a camera captured her red dress, once a symbol of confidence, now burning too bright under the harsh store lights. I felt no triumph, no cruelty, only clarity. I looked at her one last time and folded my hands in my lap. "Justice isn't loud," I said softly. "Sometimes it speaks only when everyone else goes quiet, and at that moment, everyone did. Even Julia." The silence that followed wasn't weakness anymore. It was mine reclaimed, dignified, and complete. Colton placed the heavy black folder on the glass counter, its metal clasps clicking open like the sound of judgment itself. I sat still in my chair, my hands folded as he began to pull out the documents one by one. The boutique had fallen into an eerie silence. No background music, no whispers, just the rustle of paper and the faint hum of the air conditioner. Each page landed on the counter with a dull, final sound, like a gavel striking wood. The first sheet slid forward, a high-resolution still from my hidden camera, showing Julia at my safe, her face calm, her hands steady as she removed the bundles of cash. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered near the doorway. Then came the second, the lab report stamped and signed by Dr. Linda Harper, detailing the chemical compounds found in my tea traces of thiopridol and glycopyrrolate, precise enough to paralyze the voice, but not the heart. Next, Colton placed the printed bank statements, each line item sharp and incriminating. Transfers totaling hundreds of thousands sent from my personal account to one under the name Mark Henson. The dates aligned perfectly with the days she had told me the taxes were being settled. He moved to the next sheet, a falsified business contract transferring ownership of Caldwell Mart. The signature at the bottom bore my name, but the analysis attached showed digital forgery and metadata tracing to Julia's personal email. Finally, he revealed the photographs Julia and Mark entering the Maplewood Hotel at midnight, laughing unaware of the security camera above them. The images were damning and ordinary all at once, proof that deceit always leaves a fingerprint. Julia staggered back as the papers spread across the counter like shards of her own reflection. The color drained from her face. "This is a lie," she shouted, her voice cracking. Sean will explain everything. He'll be here. He'll save me." The officers stepped forward. One of them began reading in a calm, practiced tone. "Mrs. Julia Townsend Caldwell, you have the right to remain silent." The words echoed through the boutique, bouncing off the mirrored walls until they seemed to fill every inch of air. Julia's knees gave out. She collapsed to the floor, clutching at her handbag, as if it were the last thing tethering her to power. Colton didn't flinch. His tone was almost gentle when he said, "Sean won't be coming, Julia. He signed a temporary separation this morning. His lawyer advised it was best." The world seemed to stop moving for her. The red dress that had screamed triumph now looked like the uniform of her defeat. Garrett turned toward the growing circle of reporters outside the shop window, his voice steady and clear. "This," he said, "is a textbook case of elder abuse and financial fraud in the state of Ohio. And let this remind everyone, justice never sleeps." I looked at Julia one last time. She finally understood that silence could speak louder than screams. Julia fell to her knees right in front of me, the red of her dress pooling on the marble like spilled wine. Her mascara had melted down her cheeks, her hands shaking as she reached for mine. "Please," she cried, voice breaking. "Please forgive me, Mother. I didn't mean to hurt you. I just wanted to prove I could do better than you." For a moment, I didn't move. I simply looked at her. The woman who had taken everything I built, everything I trusted, and tried to turn it into her own empire. Her face, once so proud, was now unrecognizable. Her voice, once filled with arrogance, trembled like a child's. But I had waited too long, endured too much to let sentiment undo justice. I drew a slow breath and met her eyes. "You might be better than me," I said quietly, my tone steady as steel, "but you'll never be better than what's right." The words left my mouth like a verdict. Julia's sobs deepened. She bent forward, pressing her forehead against the cold floor. The clicking of camera shutters filled the air, one flash after another, bursting like lightning across the boutique. Outside, people had gathered along the glass walls, recording the moment that karma finally arrived, public, undeniable, and complete. Two officers stepped forward. One gently pulled Julia to her feet, while the other read the last lines of the Miranda warning. The silver handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. For a second, time seemed to stop. All the noise, the reporters, the murmurs, the camera flashes, became a distant hum as I watched the woman who once declared herself untouchable now bow to the law. Garrett stood nearby, his arms crossed, jaw firm. Colton kept his eyes on the paperwork, his expression measured but satisfied. I knew none of them took joy in it. Justice was never meant to be joyful, it was meant to be true. Julia looked up one last time, tears streaking through the layers of makeup. "Please," she whispered. "I don't want to go like this." I didn't answer. I simply placed my hand on the armrest of my wheelchair and closed my eyes. The noise of the world faded, leaving only my breath and the faint metallic sound of the cuffs. When I opened my eyes again, I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph, not vengeance, but peace. My fingers tightened around the chair's armrest as I allowed myself the smallest smile. "I didn't win through hatred," I said softly, mostly to myself. "I won through the truth." And with that, I finally exhaled the weight of all the years I had carried. My name, my dignity, my voice, all of it had come back to me. not through revenge, but through justice. The courtroom in downtown Cleveland was packed that morning. Reporters filled every bench, their cameras trained on the defendant's seat. The gold seal of the state of Ohio glinted on the wall behind the judge's chair. I sat near the front, my wheelchair positioned quietly beside Colton, with Garrett standing just behind me. The air smelled faintly of paper coffee, and the heavy anticipation of justice, long delayed. Julia was led in by two deputies. She wore the standard orange prison uniform, a far cry from her usual designer suits. Her hair hung in messy strands, the glossy perfection she'd once prided herself on, now replaced by dullness and defeat. Her eyes were empty, ringed with sleepless shadows. For a fleeting moment, I saw the woman she might have been, ambitious, clever before greed had hollowed her out. The prosecutor, a calm woman with sharp diction, began her presentation. This case, she said, represents one of the most significant examples of elder abuse and financial fraud in the state of Ohio. The evidence you are about to see speaks not only to theft, but to cruelty, the exploitation of trust within a family. Then the lights dimmed slightly, and the first video appeared on the large screen, Julia opening my safe, counting cash. Next came the footage from the boutique the night she served me poisoned tea, and the audio where her voice dripped contempt as she told someone I was too senile to notice. The lab reports, the fake contracts, the financial statements, all projected in sequence. Each exhibit was a piece of a puzzle that formed a single devastating picture. Julia began to tremble when the footage shifted to her yelling at me, "Just shut up and stop embarrassing me." The courtroom fell utterly silent. Even the judge's face tightened. I sat still, but my hands trembled slightly in my lap. Not from anger, from finality. When the prosecution rested, the defense offered little more than broken apologies and tears. Julia stood up at one point, voice cracking, trying to explain that she had been under pressure, that she only wanted to prove herself worthy of running Caldwell Mart. But the jury's faces remained unmoved. After a brief deliberation, they returned. 12 pairs of eyes looked toward the judge. The foreman stood and spoke clearly into the microphone, "Guilty on all counts." The words echoed through the chamber, steady and unmistakable. Julia gasped, then began to sob uncontrollably, her body folding over the table. The sound of the gavel came down once final and cold. I closed my eyes. A single tear slipped free, not from pity, but from release. My heart didn't ache anymore. Justice had spoken, and the silence I'd carried for months finally found its voice. The verdict was read under the steady hum of cameras and whispers, every word slicing through the courtroom air like the tolling of a slow, deliberate bell. The judge adjusted his glasses, his tone even but unyielding. For charges of federal financial fraud and elder abuse in the first degree, the court hereby sentences the defendant Julia Townsend Caldwell to 12 years in state prison. The room fell into silence. Even the reporters who had been typing feverishly moments before stopped to look up. Julia stood motionless, her orange prison uniform stark against the polished wood of the courtroom. The color had drained completely from her face. I sat quietly near the front, hands folded in my lap, watching the woman who once told me I was obsolete, now staring down the rest of her life defined by bars and rules. The judge continued reading from the legal statement. Additionally, the act of poisoning the victim constitutes intentional bodily harm. The defendant is hereby prohibited from any form of contact, direct or indirect, with the victim for life, even after the completion of her sentence. Julia trembled, her shoulders shaking. Her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, but she didn't respond. Her eyes darted toward me for just a second, perhaps hoping for some sign of pity. I gave her none. Mercy belonged to those who sought forgiveness before it was too late. The prosecutor stood to deliver the court's final recommendation. Given the severity of the crimes, the state requests full forfeiture of all personal and shared assets connected to Caldwell Mart. This includes all real estate vehicles and any financial accounts derived from fraudulent transactions. The judge nodded and struck the gavel once, sealing the decision. It was done. Garrett exhaled beside me, a sound of quiet relief. Colton gathered the final documents, his expression solemn but satisfied. Around us, the reporters began whispering again, scribbling headlines that would soon echo across Ohio. Within hours, local news stations would label it the Caldwell Verdict, a symbol of justice for victims of elder abuse who had suffered in silence for too long. I didn't look at Julia as the officers led her away. The clinking of her handcuffs followed her down the corridor, fading with each step. I felt neither hatred nor joy, only a quiet balance restored. The law had done what the heart alone could not. When I finally wheeled myself toward the exit, a journalist stopped me gently. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said softly, "do you have any words for others who might be afraid to speak out?" I looked into the flashing lights of the cameras, my voice steady. "Tell them I said that silence is not kindness. Justice begins when we find the courage to speak." The order came down 2 weeks after the verdict, Restitution Order number 214B, signed and sealed by the State Court of Ohio. It was official. Every asset seized from Julia Townsend Caldwell would be returned to its rightful owner, Megan Caldwell. I sat in Colton's office as he read the document aloud, his voice steady but softened by something close to admiration. "This means everything comes back to you. Mrs. Caldwell, the house, the remaining shares, the vehicles, the accounts linked to Caldwell Mart. The law is clear. Restitution for both financial loss and emotional harm." I nodded slowly. The words didn't feel like victory, more like restoration. Justice, not triumph. What had been stolen through deceit was now returned through order and reason. For a long moment, I looked out the window at the faint Ohio sunlight spilling across the city skyline and thought of how fragile dignity could be and how powerful it was to reclaim it lawfully. Under the same order, Caldwell Mart was placed under temporary management by Colton Fisher, while I began the process of creating something new. The lawyers called it asset reintegration, but to me, it was rebirth. I named it the Caldwell Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping older women who had been victims of financial exploitation and family abuse. The first decision I made was to renovate the old house, the very home where my downfall began. The second-floor rooms were restored to their original warmth, while the ground floor was transformed into a small legal aid office. Garrett helped hang the brass plaque by the entrance. The engraving shimmered in the morning light. "No one is too old to fight for justice." Each time I rolled past that sign, I felt something quiet rise within me. Not pride, not revenge, but peace. The kind that only truth can bring. The house no longer felt haunted. It breathed again, filled with the sounds of purpose, the tapping of keys from new volunteers, the ring of phones from women seeking advice, the low hum of second chances. When the final set of ownership papers arrived, I met Colton at the courthouse to sign. The clerk handed me the pen. For a brief second, I hesitated, remembering the day I'd once signed everything away to Julia in blind trust. Then I pressed the pen down firmly, my hand steady. As the last signature dried, I looked at Colton and whispered, "I wasn't fighting to get my money back. I was fighting to get my dignity back." He smiled quietly. "And you did." Sean sat across from me in the living room that once echoed with Sunday laughter, now silent except for the slow ticking of the grandfather clock. The blinds were half-drawn sunlight cutting across the floor like thin bars of gold. His hands trembled as he held the legal documents Colton had given him, the papers that spared him from prison, but not from shame. He had been investigated under charges of negligent complicity and indirect misappropriation for signing company documents Julia had forged. The authorities determined that he hadn't directly participated in the crimes, but had enabled them through reckless trust. With Colton's careful defense and Garrett's quiet intervention, Sean avoided prison time. The court reduced his punishment to a fine and a formal reprimand, a mercy that came at a price no law could measure his own conscience. He looked different now, older, hollowed out like someone who'd aged a decade in a month. His tie was crooked, his eyes swollen from sleepless nights. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "Mom," he said, falling to his knees beside the wheelchair. "I didn't know how bad it was. I just wanted to keep the peace. I thought if I stayed quiet, things would fix themselves. I wanted our family to stay together." I looked down at him. The boy I had once carried through storms and heartbreaks now knelt before me. Not a man seeking forgiveness, but a child seeking escape from guilt. For a long time I said nothing. The air between us was heavy, filled with all the words we had never said. "Sean," I began softly, "do you understand what silence cost this family?" He looked up, tears pooling in his eyes, his lips trembling. "I was scared, Mom. She made me choose, and I didn't know how to stand up to her." My heart ached, but my resolve held. "I taught you how to read contracts," I said, my tone steady. "I taught you how to tell right from wrong. But I never realized." I paused, feeling the weight of every syllable. "I gave you life, Sean, but I couldn't give you integrity." The words landed like a verdict. The same phrase that had silenced the courtroom now echoed in our home, soft but irreversible. Sean bowed his head, shoulders shaking. His sobs filled the room, raw and unguarded. I turned my gaze toward the window, watching the light crawl across the floor. "You'll pay your fines. You'll rebuild your name," I said. "But as for my trust, that's a debt you can't repay." When Garrett came in later that evening, Sean was gone. He'd left the house quietly, leaving only his wedding ring and a handwritten note on the table. It said, "I'll spend the rest of my life earning what I lost." I folded the note carefully and placed it inside my journal. For the first time in months, I felt no anger, only the hollow ache of a mother who had chosen justice over forgiveness. The downfall came faster than anyone expected. Within 24 hours of her arrest, Julia's face was everywhere, on television screens, online articles, and thousands of social media feeds. The video of her handcuffed in the middle of Summit Plaza, crying and screaming as officers led her away, went viral overnight. The headline read in bold letters, "Perfect daughter-in-law, caught in elder abuse fraud." I didn't watch it, but Garrett told me later that it had over 10 million views in less than a day. People across the country commented, outraged by the hypocrisy. The same woman who built her image around kindness and family values had turned out to be the face of betrayal. By the end of the week, every brand that had once competed to work with Julia, the lifestyle companies, the charity sponsors, the talk shows, had erased her presence. Her photos vanished from billboards and magazine covers. The Perfect Air channel she had curated online was deactivated after floods of angry comments and hashtags calling her a fraud. Sponsors demanded refunds, lawsuits piled up, and the illusion she had crafted for years crumbled like ash in the wind. Inside prison, the reality was even harsher. Julia's name carried infamy. Inmates recognized her from the viral video and wanted nothing to do with her. Some mocked her, calling her Miss Perfect or influencer, while others simply avoided her, seeing her as a symbol of everything fake and fragile. Her manicured nails broke her skin, paled under fluorescent lights, and the silence she had once forced on me now wrapped around her mercilessly. The guard said she spent most nights staring at the small window above her bunk, watching the faint orange glow from the distant streetlights. Once, someone found her clutching a crumpled newspaper article, one that featured a photograph of the newly inaugurated Caldwell Foundation, the nonprofit born from the ashes of her crimes. The article showed women in their 60s and 70s standing proudly in front of my restored house under the brass sign that read, "No one is too old to fight for justice." According to the report, Julia didn't say a word. She simply folded the paper, pressed it against her chest, and lowered her head. I never rejoiced at her misery. There was no pleasure in watching a life collapse, only a quiet, heavy understanding that truth had done what revenge never could. The empire she tried to steal now carried my name, but it was never about the name. It was about reclaiming what no thief could touch, dignity. The morning light fell softly across the garden painting, everything in shades of gold and quiet. I sat beneath the maple tree, the one my husband had planted decades ago, holding a cup of tea between my trembling hands. The steam curled upward, warm and gentle against the cool Ohio air. The scent of lavender drifted in from the flower beds. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like peace. Garrett stepped out from the house, his footsteps crunching lightly on the gravel path. He stopped beside me, folding his arms and looking out toward the horizon. After a moment, he spoke in that low, thoughtful tone he always used when words mattered. "You won, Megan," he said quietly. "But tell me, do you feel lighter now?" I looked down at the tea, watching the ripples tremble with each breath of wind. "Winning," I said softly, "isn't the same as healing. When justice comes, the heart still has to learn how to forgive." He nodded, but said nothing more. The world around us moved gently, birds in the trees, the faint hum of life resuming. On the small wooden table beside me lay a photograph Julia and Sean on their wedding day. The colors had faded, the corners curled, but the smiles in the picture still carried traces of what used to be hope, maybe even love. Next to it rested an envelope I had never sent. Inside was a single page written on the night before the trial. "If you ever learn what love truly is, my child, then learn to love the right person." The wind lifted the edge of the letter, as if asking whether it should finally be carried away. I reached out and pressed it flat again. Some messages are not meant to be delivered, only understood. Garrett placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did what had to be done," he said. I smiled faintly. "So did the law," I replied. "But the law can't teach us mercy. That part we have to find ourselves." He stayed beside me until the sun rose higher, then quietly went back inside, leaving me with the sound of rustling leaves and my own thoughts. I sipped the last of my tea, feeling the warmth settle deep within. Justice had spoken, but peace was something I was still learning to earn. As I watched the sunlight touch the brass plaque on the garden wall, I whispered almost to the wind, "If you've ever been betrayed by someone you love, don't stay silent. Tell your story, because sharing is the strength that keeps others alive."